O Heavenly King, Comforter of the Spirit of Truth, who art everywhere present and fillest all things, treasurer of blessings and giver of life, come and abide in us and cleanse us from every impurity and save our souls, O good one. Amen.
Amen. Исполняй, Господь.
So to start a whole new segment,
You want some paper towels?
yeah, I probably could use it. Basically what I wanted to talk about, to do tonight is talk about what we want to do for the next number of weeks, and run some ideas by you. Thanks. It's still kind of a mess, but oh well. What we talked about is doing topics in church history. But what I'd kind of like to do is go over briefly kind of various areas of church history that we could talk about and see what y'all want to do. So starting at the beginning would be the Apostolic Church. Of course, we just read through the primary document on the Apostolic Church, which is the Book of Acts. But then you've got the first generation of Christians, and there's a really interesting book called the Apostolic Fathers, which is basically Clement of Rome and Ignatius of Antioch and Polycarp and writers from the first and the second centuries. The Didache, that would be more of a textual study. Then there's some of the intertestamental literature, which is some of which we talked about, like the Book of Enoch, like the Ascension of Moses, like all this this whole body of literature, which part of which they found at the in Qumran in the Dead Sea Scrolls, part of which they found in various other places, which is sometimes attributed to being Gnostic literature, kind of in between Christianity and Judaism, or in between Christian and Jewish influences, with Gnostic influence, which means usually pagan influence, and is kind of a strange religion all of its own. And it's kind of like the ancient version of the New Age, and basically it was little groups. And there's one major text on that, and that's the Against Heresies by Saint Irenaeus of Lyon, who died in the year 211. And he was a disciple of Polycarp, who was a disciple of St. John the Evangelist. So, third generation. And there were also some other interesting kinds of issues, of course, in the New Testament. Brings up the Docetist controversy. It mentions the Gnostic controversy, like 1 Corinthians was partly written against Gnosticism. Docetism, in particular, in the first epistle of St. John. Then you got the whole controversy around the Book of Revelations and all of that. So there's a lot of material there. That's one set. Then there's the second, third century texts, which would include Dialogue with Trypho by Justin Martyr, Saint Clement of Alexandria. The first Clement was Clement of Rome, and his writings were sometimes included with the other New Testament writing, or with the New Testament, and Origen, and Saint Irenaeus is kind of on the cusp between the two. So that would be heavy on the writings. Then you've got the 4th century, which is very complex and very interesting. You have the rise of Arianism. You have and writers, Orthodox writers such as Saint Athanasius, were great figures. Saint Athanasius, Saint Basil, the Great, Saint Gregory the Theologian, Saint Gregory of Nyssa. The very end was Saint John Chrysostom, and then actually a contemporary of theirs is Evagrius, and which draws on that whole Alexandrian tradition, and then the rise of monasticism. So the 4th century is a very complex period. It also has the rapprochement and legalization of Christianity, rapprochement with the Roman state, and the legalization of Christianity at the beginning of the century. Then at the end of the century, in 380, Christianity gets made the state religion. And there's some very interesting material there. Eusebius and so forth. He wrote some very panegyrics on the relationship between the church and the state, and how the great dream of a Christian society is being realized. And who doesn't think about a Christian society, right? What Christian hasn't? And it was actualized in the Christian Roman Empire. And people don't seem to understand that. That they think it was just a state political thing, state takeover, and they don't understand it at all. That was also where when the liturgies were created, and so a lot of things going on in the 4th century. The rise of monasticism. St. Anthony was born, I think, around 250, and died in 357. He was like 107 or something like that when he died. And he was written, and St. Athanasius wrote his biography, which was a bestseller. And so you had Pachomius at the same time in Egypt with communal monasticism, where he had massive communities of up to 10,000 people, monastic communities, men's communities and women's communities on either side of the crocodile infested river.
The Nile.
Yeah. And so I don't think there was too much going back and forth between the two. one couldn't swim it anyway. And then the development of the Egyptian desert and the Palestinian and Syrian deserts as the real heartland of monastic asceticism, which then spread, and it spread into the cities even. So that's an interesting history, and then the history of monastic spirituality, the history of the Great Fathers, the history of the development of hesychasm, and then some misadventures too, like Saint Cyril of Alexandria in the 5th century had an army of monks in which he went around tearing down pagan temples and things like that, kind of terrorizing the population.
Very Christian.
What's that?
Very Christian way.
Very Christian. Very Christian. But that's an interesting period. In the 5th century, you have the two great councils which caused so many problems. The first, the Council of 431 of Ephesus, in which you had the so-called Nestorian schism. The second was the non-Chalcedonian, or the so-called Monophysite schism, and all that goes into that. But from those, large portions of the church went off into schism. At the same time, in the West, the barbarian hordes were basically shutting down Roman society, and people were fleeing Rome with their retinues, and holding up in their country estates, which became castles, and trying to figure out how to survive when they no longer had their major sources of food and coming in from the African coast. So it was, so there are all sorts of factors in that. That was also the time of Augustine, and then in this, so that's the 6th, that's the 5th century. The 6th, 7th centuries was still a time of was Justinian and the rise of kind of the consolidation of Constantinople and of its power, and the reconquest of the West, parts of the West, from the barbarians, but never back to its previous state. 7th century beginning was the Monothelite controversy, and very soon after that was the rise of Islam, and which was devastating, and very soon after that was the rise of Iconoclasm, which was also devastating. But in the meantime, the Islamic hordes took half of the Byzantine Empire, the entire southern half, and then so they had to figure out what to do with that, and how to survive without vast amounts of produce and goods supporting the city of Constantinople from the south. 8th century was Iconoclasm. 9th century, end of the 8th century and beginning of the 9th was the 7th Ecumenical Council, and then in 840 the final restoration of icons, and then 879 was the so-called 8th Ecumenical Council. There are actually two. There was one in 869 and one in 879. The one in 869 is recognized by the Roman Church. The one in 879, I believe, is recognized by the Orthodox Church. And so that I don't even remember what it was about, other than that you had the Pope upbraiding the patriarch in Constantinople, saying there's no such thing as an ecumenical patriarch. You're a bishop just like any other bishop. And that's an important thing. Hello.
Hello.
And you are?
Christopher McAvoy and Christopher and Victoria McAvoy.
Very good. Welcome. So, this is everybody.
Hello.
Names provided on request.
That's right. Except then you have to go through and repeat everybody's name, and so we won't do that. What we're doing, kind of going a quick run through of Orthodox history to look at what are the areas that are most interesting to talk about over the next several weeks. So 8th century, 9th century was also in the with the defeat of Iconoclasm in the 9th century. Then in the 10th century you have figures such as you have the mission to the Slavs and the conversion of the Slavs. You know, you have the Saint Cyril and Methodius. Today was the commemoration of the day of the repose of Saint Cyril, and he and his brother were from Thessalonica, and they had been sent. Ended up actually by the Pope in Rome, and ended up in Moravia. Created an alphabet, created a written language for the Slavs, and then began to translate the liturgical texts. And then that spread, it enabled the spread of Orthodoxy, not just Constantinopolitan imperialism or Byzantine imperialism forcing everybody to speak Greek, but the texts were then available in the Slavic language. So pretty soon Bulgaria became Orthodox, the Serbs became Orthodox, and in the 10th, later on the Russians became Orthodox in 988, which was actually Kiev. The Rus were Vikings, but the Slavs adopted Orthodoxy. The Vikings, well, who knows? Some of them did, some of them didn't. But that was a radical change, because up until that time, you had the Russians laying siege to Constantinople periodically. And we even have the Feast of the Protection of the Mother of God, which is actually celebrated more by the Russians than by the Greeks, to some degree by the Greeks, but which was the deliverance of Constantinople from the Russians. So 11th century, 10th century, so that was the 10th century. 11th century, you had the first German Pope. The first time the filioque was used in Rome, and so that actually began a whole process, or it was a major stage in another process, or in this whole process of alienation of the East and the West. So by 800, the Pope had switched its allegiance. The papacy had switched its allegiance from Constantinople to Charlemagne, which was a huge issue, and just contributed further to the alienation. nobody in the West spoke Greek. Nobody in the East, or very few people in the East, spoke Latin. And in the East, they looked down on the West as a bunch of filthy barbarians, which probably they were. And so they didn't really bother with them. In the West, they were asserting their kind of independence, and Byzantium looked at Charlemagne as as some kind of a barbarian pretender to the throne, and kind of didn't take him seriously. But still, there was still general chaos in the West. But during this time, monasticism in the West was flourishing, and there was a great flourishing in Western Orthodox theology, kind of at the end of its Orthodox period, in some Cistercian theologians, who are quite interesting. 1096, the Crusades are called. So going into the 11th, into the 12th century, it's the era of the Crusades. The beginning of the 13th century, in 1204, you have the Fourth Crusade sack Constantinople, and that was a huge blow. That really ended the Byzantine Empire. They installed the Latin bishops, they installed the Latin king, and they only held it for about 60 years when the Greeks did get it back, but it was never the same. On the other hand, it issued in a great period of some of the most profound iconography in the history of Byzantium. So 13th century, you also saw the beginning of a beginning process towards reunion between the East and the West. There had been this alienation, which culminated at when the Latins rejected the Greek hierarchy in Constantinople and erected a parallel jurisdiction, thereby formally creating a schism. So in 1272, there was a reunion council at Lyon, and that was also a time of problems in the papacy, and to say the least, but nothing really came of that reunion council. In the 14th century, you had the rise of hesychasm in Byzantium, and not only as a spiritual movement within monasticism, but also even as a political movement, because essentially what happened was a monastic takeover of the church and of the hierarchy. You'd had from about the year 800, when Photius was patriarch of Constantinople, you had the rise of Byzantine humanism, and a very great scholarly tradition. There was a great university in Constantinople, and it was of course, it was the world capital essentially, at least for most of the civilized world, until you got to China, and then but it quickly became degraded after it was conquered by the Latins, and then bits and pieces of it were being picked off by the Crusader, by Islam. In the 15th century, this 14th century, you had the real rise of the power of monasticism, which really prepared Constantinople and the Greek-speaking world for the succeeding centuries in which they would be enslaved by Islam. And so there was another reunion council in 1438, and 1453, Constantinople finally fell to Islam and was never recovered, and is still under under Turkish Islamic control to this day. But by this time, you also have the rise of Russia. And so that's a fascinating history in and of itself. You can talk about the whole Kievan period. Then there's the period of the Horde, the Mongols and domination, and then in the late 14th century, the throwing off of Islamic or the Mongol domination, and Russia was finally free. And then it began, and then in the 15th century, as Constantinople was embroiled in its troubles with pleading with the West for a crusade to free it from the Turks, which would never come. And at the Council of Florence, basically they gave up orthodoxy and became Uniate in order to strengthen their case for a crusade, and a few years later they were overrun. But at that council, both the patriarch and the emperor became Uniates. So there's one can ascribe all sorts of historical or all sorts of reasons to the fall. But then with the rise of monasticism, the people were essentially prepared to be able to resist. It had the spiritual fortitude to be able to resist the Islamic conquest, whereas whereas those who were unable or who didn't want to resist and didn't want to deal with it all went to the West, and so there was a vast number of the intelligentsia from Constantinople that went to the West, which is probably one of the major factors that created the Renaissance. And the seeds of that had been sown earlier with the Fourth Crusade and the looting of Constantinople and the removal of its great treasures to the West. So with that, we can 14th, 15th century. So 1453, end of Constantinople. 16th century. 15th century was also a time in the West of the conciliarist controversies. There was a great controversy going on between the papacy and the German principalities as to whether the Pope had supremacy over the councils, or whether councils had supremacy over the Pope. One of the biggest problems with the Council of Florence is that the Greeks sided with the Pope over the councils instead of with the councils over the Pope, and so they betrayed orthodoxy. But it was a very substantial debate throughout the 14th and 15th centuries. Christopher, you had a question?
would simply wonder, as perhaps I've wondered for a decade or so, in the nature of the divine order that God would wish things to be, it would seem to me that quite possible that both, in some sense, could be the case. Would it not be possible for both the council to have the authority and the pope, to have a kind of a compromise rather than one or the other extreme, in a sense? Isn't that more ideally what the church ought to be a fusion of both of those ideas, which are complement and do not contradict?
We would say that they contradict, and it's contradictory to the ancient tradition. It's contradictory to the tradition of the first millennium. So, certainly the Pope has primacy, but he, like every other primate and every other bishop and every other person, should be subject to the ecumenical councils. And so the Orthodox, for the past 900 years, have rejected anything that would exalt the papacy over conciliar authority, and that assertion began at the end of the first millennium, but it really only became much stronger into the second millennium, and was finally canonized in the First Vatican Council in 1872 or something like that. So anyway, this is just like a broad overview of topics, and we'd have to go into a lot more research, a lot more detail on all of it. Yeah.
Something that fascinates me is the perspective of Russian history in light of the overall, and how the Russian church rose and how it started. And I would be fascinated to see how all of that, from the perspective of the Russian population, how it all kind of like came together, and the rise, and what happened in the Bolshevik Revolution, and how the church went underground, and all that. I think that'd be fascinating.
Well, it is fascinating. You're jumping ahead 500 years. So the 16th century, in the East, the 16th century was, Islamic domination. In the West, it was very significant because you had the Protestant Reformation, and then the beginning, and then you had the Counter-Reformation.
That was not the whole believer in the 16th century?
No, that was 17th century
Sorry.
in Russia. And in Russia, you had 15th century was the time of St. Neil Sorsky, and the beginning, and the Skeet tradition, and then the controversy with Joseph Volotsky as to whether monasteries should own property. In other words, whether they should own serfs and villages,
Or not.
and vast lands, or whether they should
Not have anything.
have nothing. Yeah, and so, which was a very interesting controversy. Joseph won, and that issued in a whole period in Russian church history of the rise of the huge monasteries, but a very kind of formal external spirituality, and then so 16th century, and there were also contacts between the Lutherans and in 15th, 16th century, 16th, 17th century, between the Lutherans and the Greeks, which is very interesting. And it's interesting to think that the Reformation could have been prevented. And if Luther and Henry VIII had simply returned to, had declared autocephaly and turned their churches to Orthodoxy instead of the Radical Reformation. So the 17th century, into the 17th century, 18th century, this also, of course, is the colonization of the Americas and beyond, which had a huge effect on the Western Church. Not much effect on the Eastern Church at this time, except starting in the 17th century, you had the Russian push to the south and to the east. The recovery of Kazan was what year? Do you remember? Where the Islamic Islam was pushed back.
16th or 17th.
It was I think it was 17th century.
Yeah, I think
Early,
so.
yeah.
1600 something.
And then not only did Russia conquer most of Siberia during that, began the conquest of Siberia during that period, it began the conversion of all of those people all the way to the Pacific coast, and then which set the scene for the 18th century and the vast missionary expansion of the Russian Church, which ended up all the way in Alaska by 1794. Then you've got the history of the church in North America, which is very interesting. And then, the 18th century, you've got, and and this would be actually more monastic history, Paisy Velichkovsky and the Philokalia and the effects of that on Russian literature and society, the development of Slavophile philosophy, the Kirievsky brothers and the rise of Optina Hermitage and its kind of glorification by Dostoevsky and by the other Slavophiles, and at the same time also the descent into darkness of nihilism and and the Industrial Revolution, which coincided with the freeing of the serfs. They're migrating to the cities to live lives of abject poverty, and which made them ripe for community organizers, and which resulted in the Bolshevik Revolution, among other things. And then there's the 20th century, which is very significant especially for the Russian Church, but also the Church in America, and so I mean that's kind of very broad strokes of the past 2,000 years. What interests you?
All of it.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, all of it is a graduate course
right.
for a PhD. No, that's actually too broad for a PhD. So one topic for a number of weeks would be early church. Another topic would be rise of monasticism, or monastic history could be interesting. Another would be development of doctrine, which is interesting. So that would be 4th century, really 4th century through 14th century. In other words, the intellectual history of Byzantium. Then another topic would be Russian church history. Another topic would be monastic history of the past several hundred years.
Do you have a particular desire to focus it on one area?
Well, it depends on how much work I want to do. okay.
After you want to do it.
You know, I
he's already done it.
I studied all this stuff, but there's a lot that would need to be, especially the more textually based. But that would also depend if you all want to do some homework. How much homework do you want to do?
Good.
Do you want to read a page? Do you want to read 10 pages? Do you want a week? Do you want to read a book a week? You want to build up your library? Or do you want it to be all just lecture and discussion? Or we can do a book of the Bible if you want.
I would like reading and homework myself.
You like the reading and homework?
I like homework.
Mm-hmm. Who else likes homework? Nobody likes homework.
I don't dislike it.
Okay, so
We got that.
I accept it.
It's the time to
yeah.
dedicate to the homework.
Going through that, it reminds me there was an old priest monk at the Valampivori in St. Petersburg, and I had a group, and he took us through the Hermitage, going through going through the history like that, like jogging through the Hermitage. He said, we went po galopem po Europam, at a gallop through Europe. So, what would cause me the least work would be American church history. But I can talk about the development of doctrine and monastic history and all of that. I can talk about most of that stuff. Or is there another topic entirely that you all might want to deal with?
I think everything you described, I think is very interesting.
Yeah,
I
there's
think
at least
maybe
5 or
you
6
should
words
pick
in the
and
previous.
choose out of all these subjects, the ones you'd like to study. I think we'd be happy with any of them. Really.
If we sat with a structure, maybe going through the councils, would that?
The councils, and that's kind of the development of doctrine.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
I think 14th century sounds very interesting.
What about before that?
Well,
Yeah, there's a
that's
handful of
before
stuff
that, too.
before that too.
Yeah, 14th century kind of wraps up the development of the doctrine with the Pauline councils. Paul, you had?
I would be torn between the study of the history of monasticism or else the study on the rise of the Russian church, the history of the Russian church. But everyone here might already know that, so I just might need to study that on my own, or we can cover that another time.
Okay. And what era of the Russian church? The early era, the medieval era?
Well, I like to, I think it's fascinating to see how a lot of the missionary push into America came out of around the 1700s. So there's probably a development before that, how, before the Russian faith became really dominant as far as the world goes. I think that's fascinating to me.
Well, Russia, the great missionary push. I mean, there was the imperial expansion up through the 18th century, and it was really the end of the 18th century that the missionary push.
But wasn't there an element of the monasticism that kind of fed into that?
Oh yeah, it all fed into it. Because the standard method of doing mission was they sent out a bunch of monks who would then establish a monastery and people would come to the monastery to trade with the monks and whatever, and they liked how they were treated. And so a village would develop around the monastery. Then the monks would get frustrated because there were too many people, and so they would go out further into the wilderness, and the same thing would happen.
Interesting.
And so that's essentially what happened in Kodiak. A group of monks was sent actually from Vallam in 1794, 793, 94. They arrived, set up their monastery, and the town developed. They were off doing their missionary thing, and then they got really frustrated. In fact, the monks even went on strike, and they wouldn't do anything for the Russians. No baptisms, no weddings, no funerals, no nothing, because the Russians were mistreating the natives. And the monks understood their mission was to the natives, and they didn't come there to be a parish priest for a bunch of drunken Russian merchants.
I think they were not allowed to be parish priests. The monks?
Well, they were missionaries. They were doing whatever they needed to do. So they had the church in town, which they served, and they also did the missions. And they had a monastic community, which was kind of their base. But their primary goal was to convert the Americans. Of course, the Americans happened to speak Aleut in that place. So, but that's how they understood their. So. Okay. Anybody else have any preference? Allie, we'll make sure you have lots of homework.
Give me some homework.
Okay, well, all right. Did anybody have any questions from the development of the liturgy?
Already forgot everything. No questions.
In a week?
Homework.
It's what she's given up for life.
Okay. Yeah.
So, when I had this question, I just asked it I think by one of the readers, but when we do, from a practical standpoint, I know when you can't do two liturgies on one altar table.
Right.
So we have a small table and a large table.
Mm-hmm.
And then when we come here and do Vespers on Saturday and Matins, that's the beginning of the liturgical day.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So why is it different when we do sanctified liturgy on Friday on the main altar, and then Saturday morning we do it also on the main altar table? Is that two separate days, or is the pre-sanctified something completely separate?
Pre-sanctified is separate because there's no consecration.
Okay.
At Eucharistic liturgy, what they mean, you don't consecrate the gifts on the same adamants on.
So you don't. Oh, okay.
No.
So pre-sanctified is separate.
Yeah, pre-sanctified is essentially Vespers
Right.
with the distribution of communion. And what's interesting is that in our normal typicon, the day begins with Vespers, right? And the liturgical themes of Vespers are for the next day. However, there's also another practice and I think it's the Studite practice, where the day started with Matins, or midnight office. And the Vespers actually reflected the day before. It was the last service of the day instead of the first service of the day. And so, in a sense, the Vespers, or the Vesperal liturgy, or the pre-sanctified liturgy, um, is simply the conclusion of that day of fasting. And so we do a pre-sanctified liturgy on Friday, no matter what time, whether it's at 8 o'clock in the morning or 7 o'clock at night. It's still the service for Friday. Then you've got the liturgy for Saturday morning. So there's no conflict. Now, there you could say that there are two liturgies on the great feasts, on Christmas, Theophany, and Pascha, because you have the Vesperal liturgy, which is the first liturgy of the feast, and then you have the Matins and Vesperal liturgy with the liturgy of St. Basil, and then later on you have the Matins and liturgy, like at midnight. Well, according to the Typicon, the Vesperal liturgy is supposed to be at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and would go for 4 hours. And it's a long service, right? And then with the midnight service, it's not that long afterwards. And with the Vespers, you've already entered into the celebration of the resurrection. And it's the same thing, because it's an identical liturgical structure between Pascha, Christmas, and Theophany. When there's on those feasts like Annunciation, in which there's prescribed a Vesperal liturgy, the texts are for the Annunciation and not for the next day. So, unless it's on a weekend, and this Annunciation is going to be very interesting because it's on Holy Saturday. So we'll sing the Lamentations and the canon of the Annunciation, and I don't know whether they'll change vestments or whether they just do the whole thing in blue or the whole thing in black, or who knows. So it'll be interesting.
When was started the pre-sanctified liturgy?
It's very ancient.
Yes.
I don't know. There is a liturgy of pre-sanctified liturgy of St. James, and it was just translated by Jordanville. Will be published. It's a little bit different than the one that we use, which is by St. Gregory, Pope of Rome, because the one that we use, you kind of go halfway through Vespers, and then it goes into the essentially the entrance and the preparation for communion. Whereas in the pre-sanctified of St. James, you do almost the whole Vespers, including the Apostica, and then into the reception of communion. So it's interesting. I'm hoping to do that at some point during this Lent. But certainly pre-sanctified liturgy in its current form is no later than the 6th or 7th century.
Do we use the same communion like when you have to go to see a sick person?
No.
No.
For pre-sanctified liturgy, on the Sunday before, an extra lamb is consecrated, or two.
Especially for the liturgy.
Especially for the pre-sanctified liturgy. It's not taken from the reserved gifts. Those lambs are reserved, but it's not the communion from the sick. I mean, it's all the same thing.
Yeah, well,
But-
it's the difference.
The difference is that for the communion for the sick, which is usually prepared on Holy Thursday, they cut up an extra. They consecrate an extra lamb, and then it's cut up into little pieces, and they're intincted with the Lord's blood. They're dipped in, or drops of the consecrated wine are put onto them, and then they dry out. They're dried, and in some places there's a whole little setup with a candle or a flame, and a and the metal plate where you cook them essentially.
So you mean you do that once a year?
It's usually done once a year.
So it's not like at any liturgy you've got some gifts that you keep for the
You
for
can,
whatever
you can,
reason. I mean, you may
can.
need it. You can.
but normally they're prepared on Holy Thursday, so that if you receive communion from the reserved gifts, you're actually receiving from the liturgy of Holy Thursday.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's
Wow.
interesting.
Yeah.
Never received that anyway.
Well, so you haven't been sick and in the hospital.
Not enough.
What else? I'm thinking about what to do so far as the church history goes. What other questions?
I have a question
Mm-hmm.
regarding the very first century and all the writings that you spoke of. Where did the people get their knowledge and education from to write these pieces?
Well, it was all discipleship. It was all individual discipleship.
Okay.
So the disciples or the apostles had men that they worked with and formed them and trained them, and once they deemed them ready, ordained them and made them bishops, and set them as heads over local churches, and then they did the same thing in return, and then. But then also, many of these people were very well versed in the scriptures, and they studied, and there were schools. One of the most famous was the catechetical school in Alexandria, which created some problems later on, but. It went for several hundred years as a kind of a major influence in the life of the church. So what essentially developed were local kinds of traditions of theology. So Alexandria had a local tradition, Antioch had a local tradition, Carthage had a local tradition, Rome developed a local tradition. Constantinople was never really that big a theological center to have a local tradition of theology, but the rest of the empire was focused there.
The cities at that time were large?
Constantinople was over 1 million people.
Okay.
Massive.
Okay. So there would be a great number to draw from.
Yeah, and Antioch, Alexandria were huge cities. Rome started out as a huge city, but quickly was almost deserted by the end of the 5th century. So, and in the West, you didn't have cities any longer. You had these individual castles, which were essentially family estates that were fortified, and at the end of the Roman Empire, 60% of the population were slaves, and so the families would go with with all of their relatives and with all of their servants, both the free and the slaves, and it would be a place of safety to preserve that community. Of course, slaves did the work, and the servants did the work. And the aristocracy developed into the kind of petty aristocracy of the of the West. And then some of it developed, depending on, how wealthy they were, into kings and so forth.
Thank you.
This was just for educated people, mostly.
Well, the educated people it was a very small number of people who knew how to read.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
and right.
what I understood too.
But the ones who did, and especially the upper layers of the aristocracy, were very well educated, and there were there were schools throughout the ancient Roman Empire that operated on the Socratic method, where you had these philosophers or teachers with their disciples, and they would work through texts with them and teach them how to reason and how to think critically.
But that was educated and rich. For the poor people, did you have? They were not educated,
No, they were not educated at all.
so they were going. How did they get into the Christianity?
Basically, that's one of the reasons that the churches were decorated or were painted with icons, is that the icons became a whole kind of a language that they could read, and so the people they would see all the gospel entirely illustrated, and it would bring it to mind. Also, people who don't read, they're not stupid by
I
any
didn't
means.
say that.
But they have an oral culture, and so they also tend to develop their memories very, very far more than we do in our culture, and so people would fairly easily memorize long pieces of text. So, for example, it was a normal thing in the monasteries for a monk to be able to recite the entire Psalter or the entire New Testament. And just completely by heart. So of course this was something that was encouraged. The monasteries in the West were the soul centers really of learning, and that's where people went to. They would get clerics to do their scribal work, and clerics meaning priests and monks. Whereas in the East, a lot more people could read and write, and there was a very sophisticated commerce, which entailed a lot of reading and writing and philosophy and all of that. Whereas most of that was lost in the West, except in the monasteries for hundreds of years.
It was part of the work of the priest to educate the parish, right? In a way.
Yeah, through preaching and teaching. And they did. So people learned the faith, they learned, I doubt they received very, I doubt the simple people were given lessons in dogmatic theology, but they would be taught basic doctrine. They could probably explain the creed, probably better than some of us could.
It's
So
like a puzzle fitting together.
Vladika, what century was Greek philosophy sort of adopted into Plato and Plotinus?
well, it was an organic thing because it was Greek culture, and that was simply the philosophy and the culture. Every Byzantine school kid, every Roman school child in the Greek-speaking parts of the empire read Plato and Socrates, the Greek poets and Homer and all of this stuff in school, and those were their school books, although it was given to them critically. They said they wrote this, but some of this stuff is pagan, and so we don't pay any attention to the pagan stuff. Whereas when the material was transmitted to the West, it went partly through the Arabs. And the Arabs, though actually from what I understand it went through the Greek slaves of the Arabs. But in the West, it was given uncritically. So they seized on the writings of Aristotle, for example, and they accepted it uncritically, without analyzing whether something, whether his philosophy accorded with Christianity or not, or whether it worked with Christianity. Now, in the first century, you had Plotinus and the rise of Neoplatonism, and Christianity. The fathers used some of that language, but it's a very great mistake on the part of most of Western scholars to think that that Christianity tried to express its thought in terms of this philosophy. Instead, what happened is they took the vocabulary, and a lot of the vocabulary was just in common parlance, or at least kind of more sophisticated academic parlance, and reinterpreted it, so that what emerged was a unique Christian philosophy, so that for example, you may have a whole Neoplatonic vocabulary, but if you read it with all the as a Neoplatonist, with all of the preconceptions and philosophical presuppositions of Neoplatonism, it's going to mean one thing. But if you read it in its Christian context, with all of the presuppositions coming from its Christian use, it's going to mean something entirely different. A lot of this material was taken by the scholastics and crammed into an Aristotelian framework, and Aristotelian approach to logic, and that basically doesn't work. And so our critique, the Orthodox critique of that, is that it created more problems than it solved. The whole scholastic thing was basically a disaster so far as the Orthodox critique goes.
These were Orthodox scholastics, or?
Well, no, I mean, looking at Thomas Aquinas and such.
Oh, okay.
Although St. Gregory Palamas quotes St. Thomas Aquinas.
Mm.
But there was a lot of the whole way of doing the argument, the whole way of doing theology is different in the traditional way than it is in the scholastic way. The scholastic way, it's all laid out according to Aristotelian logic. In the traditional way, it's based in a spiritual vision. And this holds true both in the East and in the West. And so you've got, some of the, like the late Cistercian fathers, from the 11th century, their writings are very orthodox, and very unlike the scholastic thought of 100 or 200 years later. But the scholastic, essentially, this whole scholastic movement essentially buried the monastic thought and theological approach of the West, and when it did try and reappear, and it was called mysticism, it was heavily persecuted, and some of the great it fell suspect to the Inquisition, and many of the great mystics were thrown in prison in the West. So, whereas in the East, it would have been they would have simply been honored as great elders. So John of the Cross, Teresa of Avila, people like that, and then you had then you had the Rhineland mystics in I'm trying to think of the name.
Swabia, perhaps.
Yeah, no. Who's the great German mystic of the 14th century, 15th century?
Oh, not the one with the something or other Christ. I don't think I could remember either.
Huh.
I'm glad you're thinking.
Anyway, remarkable writers, and but this.
I know who you mean.
Yeah, but
Eckhart or something?
yeah, Meister Eckhart. He pushed the envelope a lot. Yet he's really interesting to read, but he wasn't writing dogmatic theology. But he and his disciples did not fare well. And then especially the Spanish mystics later on ended up in prison. So the whole scholastic thing basically overtook the Western Church, and then it went through all these philosophical permutations, and some of it came from accepting the Neoplatonic and Aristotelian presuppositions, like the whole nominalist controversy. It's very problematic, and it forced a total redefinition of how the church thought about the sacraments, how the church thought about theology.
The Western Church.
And well, yeah. And especially in relation to the Eastern Church. Yeah.
Vladika, what would you think might be some of the origin around the late first millennium and beginning of the second to have given rise to the new trends in the life of the soon-to-be separated Latin Church with this Scholasticism?
Well, Scholasticism didn't really rise for another 100, early 12th
Or
century.
soon after, at least.
Yeah. Well, it was the Arabs through the Arabs in Spain introduced Aristotle, and that spread, and that created a kind of intellectual ferment in the universities were just being established at that period, and the the you had mainly the Benedictine orders and their various forms, but then you had the development of the friars and the mendicants, and especially the Dominicans, who were particularly involved in the development of scholasticism, and it was a very different approach to monasticism. It was or to spiritual life, and it was centered in the universities as opposed to the monasteries. And so, as opposed to monks and mystics, the great authorities became scholars, and so there was a whole kind of exaltation of that scholarly. Thomas Aquinas died in 1272 on the way to the Council of Florence, or of Lyon. But at the end of his life, it's interesting. He wrote that everything that I've written, it's like as grass for the fire, or something like that. Because he had a vision of the living Christ, which totally transcended all of the rationalist kind of approach. What it was, I mean, put in other terms, the mystical versus the scholastic is, you had a whole theology focused on spiritual perception, on noetic perception, and the attempt to translate that into theological categories. Whereas with scholasticism, it was all forced into rational categories, and the attempt to force noetic perception into rational categories, which doesn't work. You can express it, but you can't force it, and this forced it, and so the rational became predominant over the noetic. And so somebody was saying they characterize.
But why?
Why?
Why? I don't understand what the appeal was. Is this a mystery?
I don't either.
I'll keep studying.
Historically, what was going on in Spain, of course, it was still occupied by Islam, and they had Greek slaves who were they employed to teach, and they did, and so they brought their texts with them, but they didn't teach. They didn't teach the full context. They just conveyed the text. The Islamic conquest went well up beyond the Pyrenees into half of France, and so there was there was this kind of civilizational conflict or face-off, and eventually Islam was pushed back. But it was the Muslims weren't pushed out of Spain until 1492. At that time, there were many. I don't think there was a lot of Byzantine influence in the West at that time. The Byzantines were pretty preoccupied with trying to keep Islam at bay, and so their focus was to the east. It was to keep Islam at bay on one hand, and on the new missionary effort to the Slavs to the north. So they were preoccupied, and then with the 13th century, 12th, 13th century was the era of the Crusades, and that was which ended up as a catastrophe, and so the West was pretty much isolated unto itself. So it's a good question.
Was there any reason why the Cistercians developed their mystical aspect?
Well, their whole tradition focuses on contemplative prayer.
I mean, toward the end, you said they were sort of more philosophical or more
Well,
mystical.
there were some great theologians
Okay.
or great writers, theological writers, and there were some great writers throughout the Middle Ages.
Yeah.
But they never really, because the whole society was pretty depressed. I think it's probably a good way to put it. And in a very kind of primitive state, there wasn't much communication. I don't think that there was a whole lot of. I don't think there were authors were read very much outside of their immediate contexts until later. So I may be wrong, there was Bernard of Clairvaux, but he was commissioned by the papacy to preach the Crusades, and so I think if I remember right, he went on a kind of a campaign to raise armies, essentially, which is what it was. So. So, yeah.
I might make one quick comment, which many people who are more scholarly or have studied these types of things might be aware of, or people who've studied art history, but one way which I've noticed that is evident to see the connection of the scholastic Aristotelian theological trends influencing the life of the Latin Church between 1000 to 1300, particularly even after that, is in the conception of what a church temple is to be like, and the sacred arts in general, where around the year 1100, in Italy certainly, and in much of the Germanic area and Frankish area near Italy, the style of sacred art was a Latin variation of that of the Byzantine
Right.
East. It was very Byzantine. It was not naturalistic. It was not rationalistic. It was harmonious, generally speaking, with the East. And some of the further north, it was more uniquely influenced by the Celtic and other things. But with that trend, in the Gothic period, in the scholastic period between 1100 and 1300, and even after that, it became what it is today, the origins. People like Giotto, they all had earlier, people before them, but even the nature of the very famous Norman and French Gothic cathedrals and those styles, where they're in early reliquaries gradually transformed into sanctuaries, to statuary, three-dimensional, freestanding, and freestanding statuary, other than reliquaries, did not exist before 1100 that I'm aware of. Some people debate that, but I don't believe there's genuine evidence. It's very clear, and there are treatises on sacred art which connect to the Aristotelian point of view in the 1100s, which help you want to understand how art changed too. So I think there are many, many ways that do show this. I would also say, probably from what I know, the growth of cities, the way cities like Paris and Padua became west. All of a sudden the cities grew again after the period of the Crusades began. So I do agree, a sense of wanting to, what's the word, to apologize against Islam was very profound. Islam was profoundly influencing the Latin West at that time throughout the Crusades. But then, also the newly established urban culture was influencing everything, and that was intimately connected, as you said, to the the universities and to mendicant orders, which are urban in nature. So much to think about, but thank you. I've enjoyed this. It's been a blessing for me, and my wife too, I'm sure.
Well, I wonder too how much the introduction of mathematics through the Arabs, of higher mathematics, it certainly is what enabled the construction of the great cathedrals and things like that. Because up through 1100 or so, they were kind of low Romanesque stone buildings and kind of big stones and dark, but I think of the engineering math needed to create, a charter or something like that.
And the concept of masonry, both good and bad to some extent too, maybe had some origins.
Yeah. Anyway, before we break, I was thinking, how about if we do? We'll look at the councils. We'll start with some of the early literature, briefly, but then we'll go through the councils. And I'll try and make some handouts.
True and false?
What's that?
True and false?
No, no.
Hand
No.
Do you want a test?
Right, sit there. Yeah,
Multiple choice.
If you want a test, we can arrange that. With some key passages. For those, there's a couple of good books. There's some really easily available books. One would be Metropolitan Hilarion Alfeev's Volume 1 of Orthodox Christianity. It's his series Orthodox Christianity, and it's Volume 1 in Church History. In fact, we could use that as a textbook, actually.
It's called a series on Orthodox Christianity.
Yep. St. Vladimir's Press.
Volume 1 is just coming out.
No, Volume 4 just came out.
Oh.
Volume 1 has been out for quite a while. And Volume 2 is his dogmatic theology. 3, I think, is art and architecture. And 4 just came out. Anyway, so that's one. There's another. If you want to really do a more scholarly approach, there's an older series by Yaroslav Pelikan, and that's when he wrote it, he was a Lutheran, but he saw the light and became Orthodox, and ended up as a trustee of St. Vladimir's for a while. If you want a really interesting read, there's Eusebius's Church History, and that was written in the 4th century, so it doesn't go much beyond the reign of Constantine.
Wow.
So my guess is that that would be a good start. There's also the book The Apostolic Fathers.
That's a tough one.
But it's also got some really interesting stuff, some really beautiful stuff. Some of St. Ignatius of Antioch's writings are really beautiful. I find Clement of Rome hard to read. Kind of boring, actually. But there's interesting stuff in there. But it really sets the tone of what was going on in the first 150 years of the church. If anybody wants to really delve in, and you can get Saint Irenaeus of Lyon on against heresies. Also on Amazon, you can get the entire Nicene, post-Nicene Fathers, which is 38 volumes.
It's for the extent.
And I think if you get the Kindle edition, I think it's $3.
Light reading.
Light reading. It has all the writings. It has what, 8 or 10 volumes of St. John Chrysostom, 8 or 10 volumes of St. Augustine.
Have you read them all?
No,
It's a lot of reading.
that's a lot of reading. But that's actually worth having as a reference. So this would be like a seminary level course. At this rate. So, and I'll incorporate, talk a little about liturgical history and monastic history at the same time, just to kind of give a broader perspective of what was going on.
Sounds good.
Okay.
It was more than what I expected.
That's a start. That's a start.
It is truly me to bless the Theotokos, ever blessed and most pure, and the Mother of our God, more honorable than the cherubim, more glorious beyond compare than the seraphim. Without corruption gave us birth to God the Word. True Theotokos, we magnify thee. The blessing of the Lord be upon you through his grace and love for mankind, always now and ever, and to ages of ages. Amen. Amen.